The Judaic contribution, in my view, is radical egalitarianism. The lowliest and the weak are valuable. And when you persecute them, God is on their side. Their blood calls out from the ground. It's time to
So Norman, first off, I'd like to say well done. I think your review was very well written. I'm biased, but I think it was persuasive and hit the core of what a lot of Shapiro's followers feel when they hear him talk about religion. But I want to begin by simply asking you what you thought of Ben's argument in The Right Side of History. Like, for those who haven't read it, what are the biggest things Shapiro is trying to say, and what does he get right?
Well, I think probably one of the problems of any book like that is that he's trying to say everything. He's going through his understanding of basically every epoch of history and kind of fitting it all together and saying why he agrees with his particular Jewish perspective on all of that. And so the project is really huge and can't possibly fit into that many pages, as he recognizes in the first few pages of his book. He talks about how he's going to have to give short shrift to some things. And he definitely, in my opinion, gave too short a shrift to Protestantism, which basically gets no mentions other than dismissals. I mean, he gives one kind of puff to the idea that Bible reading spread and that was helpful in pulling down theocratic structures, I think is how he put it. But that was basically all of the benefits that he gave to Protestantism in the entire book. But what he does well, though, especially the earlier, before Christianity part of the picture. In the first few chapters of the book, he lays out basically pre-Christianity history. And in that period, he talks about what the West is eventually going to be built on, and he talks about the political structures of Athens and Rome. And then mainly Athens, of course, and then he connects that, or he ties that with Jerusalem, the contributions of Jerusalem. And so he goes through, here's the values that I think Jerusalem or Judaism basically brought to the Western world picture, and then here are the things that I think that the Greeks brought to the Western world picture. And I think he does a pretty good job of gaining some nuggets from there and putting forward some of the best ideas, because in the piece, I try to summarize that as best I can. And I show how, for instance, you kind of get to the idea of what we now call science when you combine the Jewish idea that everything is created by one God, which if everything is created by one act of God, then all things kind of progress from each other. And in the Jewish conception, that God is also a lawgiver, so everything is going by strict orderly laws. And then you combine that with the Greek idea that human reason is capable of so much, of going into the farthest reaches of the galaxy and having the rules that work here govern that part of the universe as well. When you kind of combine those two things, you get to the basic notions of modern science, which basically assumes that what's going on, the reason that governs our brains, is capable of leading to discovery in the most remote parts of the universe. So anyway, that's my favorite part of the book, is his getting out some of the kernels from both Judaism and Athenian paganism, philosophic paganism, I should say.
Can I throw in something here real quick? When I was reading that section of the book, it was interesting to me because he interacts mainly with Jonah Goldberg, Yoram Hazony, Steven Pinker, and the prevailing thought he was kind of wrestling against was the pro-enlightenment idea that reason is everything. The scientific method is everything. And what Ben seemed to bring out was, it was kind of refreshing because he was kind of coming from that perspective, but he was saying, look, the scientific method has a philosophy, right? There's an underlying philosophy that without which the scientific method can't achieve. And you can't, by the scientific method, come to that philosophy because it presupposes it. Like the nature is uniform and reason is trustworthy. Well, how do we know that? Well, we reason it. Well, you've just begged the question. Right. Nature is uniform. How do we know? Well, we observe uniformity. So, that it has to. Those are presuppositions that came from a religious background which it seems like it was just refreshing to me to hear somebody say that who's kind of coming from the pro-Enlightenment school.
Right. I wouldn't necessarily call him the pro-Enlightenment school in the same way that Jonah Goldberg and Steven Pinker are, precisely for the reason that you gave. They both seem to side more with Enlightenment reason and the capacity of Enlightenment reason, although Jonah Goldberg kind of caveats that by saying that we need a few dogmas. We need to be dogmatically committed to a few propositions in order for capitalism and Enlightenment theories to work. But
right. And where do they come from?
Right, exactly. Ben, that's why I called Ben's position a little bit more nuanced. He goes, he says that we need to get back to in touch with the cultures that gave those to us, which I think is exactly right. And rather than just being committed dogmatically to certain capitalist ideas and just forgetting where they came from, we need to be in touch with the actual root of those ideas. And I think that's true. And I agree with Ben more on all of that as well. But you are right that he does seem to come down on the Enlightenment side in some ways as well, even though his main reservation on that is how reason itself, especially when applied to government, went so terribly wrong in the French Revolution. And so the reason why he distanced himself from Pinker, and his main criticism of Steven Pinker, is that, why didn't you mention the French Revolution? Like in all that talk, you didn't even mention
all his Enlightenment talk. You don't talk about perhaps the most important historical event coming out of the Enlightenment.
Right. And on this point, I'm of course fully am on Ben Shapiro's side, but I don't know if I fully agree with his diagnosis of what exactly went wrong there. I think Ben needed to distance himself a little bit more from Enlightenment philosophy than he actually did. He seemed to be pretty supportive of ideas like individual sovereignty, which again is, I think, much preferable to the kind of sovereignty that they had in the French Revolution, which was like communal national sovereignty. The voice of the people is the voice of God. I think that idea can be a heck of a lot more dangerous, and was in the French Revolution. But we are seeing, I think, today the ramifications of the notion of individual sovereignty in, Supreme Court decisions like Obergefell, where you're able to define your own concept of existence, those kinds of things. Individual sovereignty, I think, is as misguided, even if its historical ramifications aren't quite as bad.
Or we haven't seen them yet.
True. We don't know exactly where we're going at the moment. But yeah, I do think his criticism of the French Revolution style politics kind of misses what I think is the real critique there, which is that both of them are godless, right? The when I'm sovereign, when like Ayn Rand objectivists, there is no God but I, right? That's just as bad as the French revolutionaries who say there is no God but the people, right? And I think that nuance could have been fleshed out a little bit better. I think Ben might actually agree with what I just said, but I think it could have been fleshed out.
Just didn't touch on it. Well, one of the things you said at the beginning of your explanation, Norm, is history and how he goes through it. And one of the things that stuck out to me was the way Shapiro portrayed history. Because one of the old things you hear is that those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. And it entitles that those who don't study history regress and you repeat history. Whereas he said that history is very linear. And that's why we're able to see markers throughout history of actual progression. You see more equality. You see good things happening throughout the West.
Let me agree with what you're saying there. One of the main points in the early part of the book, which I talked about earlier, those Greek ideas combining with Jewish ideas. One on the Jewish side of the ledger is that idea of progress.
Yeah.
For him, he talks about the myth of eternal return, which is kind of how pagans saw the world as just, you actually get this in the Old Testament too, a little bit, where there's nothing new under the sun. Everything has happened already. That you get an escape from that with the messianic understanding of the world, where you're progressing toward an end goal, which combined philosophically with the idea of the Greek telos, which he talks a lot about, which just means end, right? Aristotelian philosophy says that everything has a beginning, middle, and end, and that coincided with the Jewish perspective on history. So there's an end to which we are all progressing, and so that gives a very different perspective on history than a much less resigned and nihilistic view of history than pagans might have had.
Kent, do you have any thoughts on that?
On the history piece, the only thing I would say is it seems Ben likes to use the term Judeo-Christian, and we all can understand why. A lot of the values overlap and are similar. But just like you pointed out, you could make the case that the Old Testament does have, at least you can read into it, some of that same kind of ancient pagan cyclical idea of history, where the fact that they were messianic kind of changed that. But you can make the case that they weren't really dogmatically messianic until the captivity. And in Babylon, they're like looking forward to the Messiah to come and liberate them. And then when Christianity comes, you might say, okay, well, it's all over now. But Christianity didn't do that. Christianity said, okay, Jesus has come, but he's come once, he's going to come again. So there's still this apocalyptic end of history to which we're moving. So it kind of has a linear, like, here we go. And I think what Ben's point was, and I think it's well made, but I think you could even give more credit to Christianity than he does, in that you can have real progress because we're not inevitably going to come back to where we started from. It's like the Enlightenment happened. There's no going back to pre-Enlightenment. The Reformation happened. We're not going back to the Catholic Church. 1776 happened. The United States, Republican form of government. We don't need to go back to the divine right of kings. Like, this was a progress. We're moving forward, which is different than what he was calling the pagan notion of the cyclical view of history. I think you could probably give a little bit more credit to Christianity on that, considering that it's just as messianic. I mean, it's called Christianity.
Yeah.
Christ means Messiah. That's
right.
The messianic religion. And that linear view of history comes through both, but I'd say even more the Christian element of the Judeo-Christian.
Yeah, but I don't know if that's necessary to even really worry too much about, because it's happening. His point on that is so early in the book that he hasn't really even mentioned. He mentions Christianity, but he hasn't yet gotten to that portion of history. And I do think the Jews have that prior to Christianity even.
Yeah, sure.
To expect a Messiah, you already have to have the messianic vision.
I mean, the Genesis chapter 2,
right.
Or the chapter 3, the seed of the woman will come and bruise the head of the serpent. It's like, it's pretty early on once you see it, but
right.
Genesis is a big book, and that's one verse, but then you can read into the promise of Jacob to Judah and all sorts of stuff that Christians now looking back say, see, it's been messianic the whole time. But that didn't get fleshed out nearly to the degree that it does with the book of Revelation, for heaven's sakes.
Well, we can also leave room for the development. We believe God revealed himself at different points in history. That doesn't mean that the understanding of God didn't progress through all of that time.
Of course, yeah. The one point I wanted to touch on that I would love to hear you elaborate more. You made the point in your review, but it seems to be kind of part of your main criticism of Ben was the difference between what we see today, these neo-Marxist relativists, and Ben kind of calling them pagan. He's like, okay, so ancient pagans had many gods, so there could be many truths. And look around today. People think that there's many truths. Don't we wish we could have one God so that there'd be one truth? And so neo-Marxism, relativism, that's paganism. Monotheism, that's what we're holding to as an absolute truth. And you're saying, no, hold on, Ben. That's not quite a fair definition of paganism, and it doesn't even really understand the real threats of paganism. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that? Like, what's the distinction? What has Ben missing there?
Well, yeah, I think the last point you made is the reason why I thought it was worth bringing up, because I don't even think he's necessarily wrong. I do think the pagan worldview has a pantheon of gods that are warring with each other. That is a very natural way of looking at the world, which is not particularly prone to science. Right. And it's not particularly prone to the idea that all things are going to be connected by laws to each other. And therefore, you can, with science, connect everything back to a first cause. That's not necessarily going to spring forth out of the pagan worldview. But I think what you said at the end there was right. The thing that it misses, the reason why I mentioned it so much, is that what's dangerous about paganism, I don't think, is that particular element of it. I think that's just the way humans happen to look at the world naturally. But the danger of paganism, in my view, is that the self gets worshipped through the tribe. looking at yourself and seeing yourself and your kids and in your progeny and in your future, and you worship that element, you become, and pagan religions throughout the world have this problem too, which is not just polytheism. It's not just the problem of polytheism. It's also the problem of might makes right. It's the problem of when I conquer, I am blessed by the gods. And that kind of conquest ideology, I think, saturates paganism and is a value structure. And so that element, I think, is something that if Ben saw that element of paganism, he would better understand our current moment, especially now that we have so many people returning to anti-Semitism and the alt-right and these returns to tribalism, which are not just relativism, right? Marxists use relativist language to try to pull down the West, right? And that's something that Ben Shapiro is very much against.
But Marxists aren't relativists. They believe in an absolute truth, the state, the conflict theory, and even a messianic hope of a day of a Marxian utopia.
Yeah. Can I quote Norm with what he says here to that point? He says, sure. Marxists are true believers in a pseudo-Christian utopian vision for society based on principles excised from the Western tradition. Thus, Marxism is best understood as Christian heresy or false messianism. It is no accident that the intersectional culture of America's left-leaning college campuses perversely embodies Jesus' description of the kingdom of God, where the first shall be last and the last shall be first.
Right. Okay, so I'll make that point before I go back and finish the paganism thing. Yes, you are exactly right that Marxism itself is not relativism. It weaponizes relativism to pull down cultures it's against. Right. So thank you for stopping me there to kind of make sure I made that point. But the point I was making about paganism before that is that the Marxists themselves aren't pagans, but by pulling down the Western structure, the West that is built on Judaic values and Greek philosophic values,
they're creating the vacuum.
They're creating that moral vacuum of nihilism, which can be filled very, very easily and naturally by a pagan worldview. And the pagan, not just the pagan polytheism, not just a relativism. It's the
way you defined it in the article was the worship of the self immortalized in the tribe.
Right, exactly.
Kind of a definition of paganism, and that seems to be somewhat of a default human position, absent the God of Abraham. It's people tend to say, well, me, my ancestors, my progeny, that's who I care about. Mm-hmm. Your ancestors and your progeny, we must defeat you. That seems to be the most natural human impulse, absent the God of Abraham.
Right. So that piece, I think, if you add that piece of paganism into it, the values of self-worship, onto just the polytheistic perspective of the universe, you really see what the nefarious element of paganism is. And that can come in even to people who have been taught the Judeo-Christian worldview. A return to tribalism is easier in some ways, even than the return to a polytheistic view of the world. And what I think we're seeing today with the rise of things like the alt-right, but it's not just the alt-right. The alt-right is just the one that everybody hates. We had, when you have Pan-African black nationalism, I think that's the same thing. We just condone it more than we would when whites do it, because they have been oppressed. And so when they have, a lot of reasons, but it's still a form of paganism, basically. It's seeing yourself as a member of a tribe first and foremost, and finding your meaning in that.
The Gospel Coalition writer, Thabiti Anyawibli, that you've interacted with a little bit, because he seems to be making a similar point. He says basically the black identitarianism is not the same categorically as white identitarianism. And it'd be kind of like, okay, so if the slave master starts waving his racial flag, you're like, that's a problem. But when the slaves do it, they're like revolting against the slave master. Like, you put us in this position. So when we kind of unify ourselves in order to try to overthrow you, there's a virtue there. There's a goodness there. Where when the slave masters are flag waving about their own race, like, no, you're just celebrating your own position of power and privilege and oppression. Yes. And it seems like when we look at black nationalism and we can say, or Pan-Africanism, and we're kind of like something it doesn't sit right with me, but it doesn't bother me nearly as much as somebody with a doggone swastika on their sleeve. A white guy skinhead. Like, that's worse for some reason.
Well, the reason should be obvious. The Judaic values, and I talk about this a little bit in the piece too, maybe we can get into it a little bit more. The element that I think is the biggest contribution that Judaism brings is what Ben Shapiro talks about in Genesis 1:26, where he says man is made in the image of God. Now, Ben kind of interprets that as like an individual rights kind of thing. Every human is a little tiny sovereign, like we were talking about earlier, and that gives him his individual rights that the state cannot violate. I think that's kind of a too Protestant perspective on what the Judaic contribution is, and I think Nietzsche actually hits it more correctly. The Judaic contribution, in my view, is radical egalitarianism, which, again, the left, being a false messianism, it takes way too far and uses to pull down nature itself, right?
It's easier for the Marxist left to justify their views based on the teachings of Jesus,
right,
than it is for the identitarian right to do so.
Yeah, exactly right. And so when, where were we going with that before?
You're saying Nietzsche's view of the radical egalitarianism.
Yes. Yeah. So I think Nietzsche actually understands the Judaic contribution even more, that Judaism brought to the table radical egalitarianism. The lowliest and the weak are valuable. And when you persecute them, God, is on their side. Their blood calls out from the ground. And
pretty Genesis 4, yeah.
Right, exactly. And so that element, I think, is the part that Judaism brings to the table, which is why when you look at something like when you look at black nationalism, for instance, and yes, it is a form of paganism. It's pagan identity, ethnic-based identity, but it is the ethnic-based identity of a weak and persecuted people, right? Or one that has historically been weak and persecuted. And when you see the weak rise, the Judaic element of us goes, yes, we like that. We want them to succeed, and we want them to have the things that we took from them. However, I think Thabiti does not acknowledge the danger in that. I think you're in your Judaic love of seeing them succeed, you're feeding them paganism, in my view. But
that's where I think just from the evangelical world, the debate that's going on the evangelical left and the evangelical right, they can't seem to talk to each other about that. Right. Because you'll have the John MacArthur, James White side that, I don't know if you read the social justice and the gospel statement, where they basically just said, forget social justice, throw out all these leftists from Christianity. But then you have the leftists, most of them probably still vote Republican, but they're more more on the left side of the social justice issue, but they can't seem to have that argument, because it's like, when Thabiti Anyawibli says, no, black pride is a good thing, James White quotes, no, there's no Scythian nor barbarian or Jew nor Gentile in Christ. And like, they both have a fair point,
yes,
to make. But it's would that the political polarization wasn't, this is a totally side issue, I guess, but would that there could be this kind of discussion within the evangelical community, because it is kind of tearing apart at the seams.
Well, there's also one more, just to follow this little rabbit trail. Sorry, Anthony, we're kind of really rabbit trailing you. But just to follow this, I think, to one particular place where we can conclude it, I think there's another complicating factor there, and that is that there can be a place for something like a black church, based not in ethnic pride, but in shared experience. Yes, shared experience. We suffered like Christ did through slavery, and that gives us a unique perspective. And so we, as a black church, bring something to the table in terms of that experience that a white church cannot do. And so there's that also complicating element that really we can get into on another podcast.
Well, I was just going to also, it's much more of a simpler point, but to the Judaic part about the weak, that's why conservatives, I guess, or the evangelical right is like pro-life about what you do to the weakest amongst these. Yeah,
and that's one thing that unites the political left and the political right within evangelicalism.
Yeah,
it's they're both equally pro-life.
Yes.
Which differentiates them from the secular left.
Right, secular left and secular right are not pro-life. You will get some kinds of pro-life-ism from the alt-right, but it's always
Racial.
pro my kids.
They're perfectly fine with Planned Parenthood because they're in black neighborhoods. They don't want a Planned Parenthood opened up in a white neighborhood, which is like, when you look at the evangelical right and the evangelical left, they point that out. They say, look, Margaret Sanger was a racist eugenicist. Stop supporting her organization. And they do kind of speak with one unified voice there, which is refreshing. Would that it wasn't about, would that issue didn't exist for them to speak about, but it is refreshing that they do speak with a unified voice on it.
So I also wanted to get into where you discussed nationalism, Norm, because this is where Yoram Hazony read, and he retweeted your review, because you talked about how Yoram's provided a needed corrective to Jonah Goldberg's view of the 30 Years' War. And you said that Yoram basically said that it didn't, like, the 30 Years' War wasn't a consequence so much of religious divisions, but it fell more along like national lines. It reflected growing national consciousness. And then you went on to say in your article that what really exhausted itself during the 30 Years' War wasn't religion, it was paganism.
Right. Let me get to that, because that's actually a really kind of tricky, almost wonky point. It shouldn't be, because we should know a little bit more about history.
My question is, can you expound on that?
Well, these epics of history we don't really learn much about in school anymore, unless you take history as a degree, which is sad, because I think some of these history has embedded in it our ideas that we try to flesh out in our own brains through reason today, fleshed out much more logically, because we don't realize the biases we have in our one generation, right? We see the world in one particular perspective and then try to reason our way out of that, and that's nearly impossible. But when you dialogue with history, you can see how somebody completely with the opposite idea, right? If you read Plato and Aristotle, for instance, the reason that's so enlightening for so many people is because they were pro-aristocracy, right? We are pro-democracy. Our assumptions are all pro-democracy. Their assumptions are mainly pro-aristocracy. And so just that dissonance and seeing the world through such a different perspective opens your thoughts to ideas that you just could not have had if you're stuck in your own time period. But one of those epics of history that I think that we need to talk more about is the 30 Years' War. And there's basically within conservatism a split on this. There's basically the pro-Enlightenment view, and a different view that Yoram Hazony had, David P. Goldman has, and others have, which I think is actually more accurate. The Enlightenment perspective is basically sees history as, dark ages and religion, and then Enlightenment takes
science.
Yay, science.
Yay, science.
Exactly.
Science be praised.
Right, which in the French Revolution became very, very literal. But the 30 Years' War is a period where that doesn't get much discussed in that, but the pro-Enlightenment view sees it as the religious wars that basically made all of Europe go, religion, I hate that stuff. And now we're going to go be nationalists and all these secular things that are great. But that's not exactly, I don't think, what happened. I think it is better understood the way Yoram Hazony talks about it in his book, which says that during that period, we were actually developing the national consciousness. Germans were seeing themselves as Germans, French were seeing themselves as French first. And that's because what had united them in the medieval world, everybody saw themselves as Christians first. Like, you can see this and you can kind of imagine this by thinking about America, right? We now all think of ourselves as Americans first. There was a time when, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington would have seen themselves as Virginians. But that was kind of going in reverse at that time period in Europe. People, instead of seeing themselves as Christians first, because the Catholic papacy was going through, schism and had several competing popes and all sorts of other things, and Machiavelli comes in with his realpolitik and looks at the world completely secularly. During that time period, the legitimacy of the Christian overarching identity was fracturing. And so people were identifying as Germans and French and Spanish and all this instead. And so the 30 Years' War was really the birth of that. And what you see, and this I got from David Goldman's analysis, is the idea of I'm going to be the nation chosen to lead Europe. That idea, the Germans are going to restart the Holy Roman Empire, and Germans are going to run everything. Or the French, we're going to do it through Catholicism, or the Spanish are going to have Spanish-led Catholicism. Those types of ideas were moving back toward a pagan, ethnic-based identity first, not a Christian-based identity first. Even though all of these would have called themselves Catholic, Protestant, or whatever, they really were fighting over their ethnic dominance. And so in that sense, really, those wars were wars of paganism, couched in Christian language. We are the chosen people of God really means we are the beloved of the gods, right? That's not a Judaic God as so much as it is a God of conquest. And so moving through that period, it's no surprise then that you get towards secular nationalism almost immediately. And it's not also surprising that the nationalism of the world wars and all of that follows a similar trajectory and ends up, really rejecting Judaic values and it becoming super problematic. And I think you can see the seeds of paganism in the 30 Years' War manifest themselves in the Nietzschean Overman and in Hitler's attempt to resurrect a Teutonic race. So anyway,
well, because there's two. It's strange because it's almost paradoxical because you have two competing realities there with the Protestant Reformation and eventually with the 30 Years' War. This emerging nationalism is pagan in a sense. They're appealing to their ethnic pride, and you can see the Catholicism's view of that is Martin Luther is not a Christian reformer; he's a pagan. He's appealing to an innate paganism within these people, which we as Catholics have been spending centuries trying to get them to get over.
Right. That's why they would.
But on the other hand, what Yoram's point, the emerging nationalism that came by virtue of Protestantism is actually more Judaic in a sense. The Judaic concept of the nation is different than the Catholic notion of the universal. The Jews never wanted a universal world Jewish empire, at least not biblical Jews. You would be, God says to Abraham, I will make you a blessing to all of the nations.
Right, exactly.
The other nations are there, and it's good that they're there. And there's a border between us and the Canaanites or whoever else it is.
I want to mention one particular point on that, and I think that this is something that Ben could have maybe mentioned in his book, but I think most of his Christian influence comes through Catholics, at least if the masthead of Daily Wire is any indication. But the combination of Christianity with Roman ideology might have had something to do with that.
I never. I guess we should have thought of that with the name Roman Catholic. We might have thought maybe there was some Roman influence.
Right, and so. The Catholic idea of a universal church or universal values that every person in every particular nation should be adhering to, I think I fully agree with.
Yeah, you're not a German. You're a Roman Catholic who happens to be German. And Luther's like, heck with that. I'm a German.
Right. Exactly. Right.
It's a paradox because it's like what I'm saying is that it's paradoxical. Is it is kind of a pagan impulse, but it's also kind of a Judaic impulse. Like there's a nation. No, it's not adhering to some universal authority.
I think there's a big difference there between universal jurisdiction and a universal value, and that played a large part in the disputes, in lots of disputes, even within Catholicism, about the role of the church, whether or not it should have land and how much property it should have, and should it have any property at all.
What authority it has over the king and that kind of thing.
Exactly right. And a lot of that got really confused because once the secular power of Rome died and there was no secular authority, obviously different than the Christian authority, especially once that got mixed up with the Constantine making the Christianity the state religion. You just had there was the role of the church just kind of almost accidentally adopted a lot of secular authority, and so it's a very confusing thing what the role of the church and the role of the state should be during that time, and there were a lot of different theorists on that. But I do think the move away from the Roman imperial vision, which is what I think Catholicism became. I think you're right to say that Luther was in a way reacting against that and as a Christian nationalist against Roman Empire. but also
if
you
his
have to acknowledge.
kids, what I'm saying is if so Luther himself, so say Luther's kids happen to drop that little bit of justification by faith doctrine, they fall into paganism real quick.
Well,
and
Luther
obviously
himself, I think, fell into paganism a little bit. I think on the Jews and their lies is pretty, you don't get there. I think there's a connection between that and his flattery of the German nation, right? You guys deserve to rule Europe, he basically says in the letter on the to the Christian nobility of the German nation. He basically says, you guys deserve to run Europe. And that's problematic, and I think it did lead to his problematic.
Well, and I think it does touch on what I think is one of the important points of your article. Like you talked about it a little bit at the end of the article, but you can obviously see Ben's hesitancy to give too much credit to Protestant Christians when their founding person was anti-Semite, and so he's like, so what we're talking about is there's the dual truths that it's a pagan impulse and it's also a Judaic impulse. This worship of the self through the continuance of the tribe is an ethno-nationalist. That's a pagan impulse. Nevertheless, breaking from the universal governance and kind of establishing national boundaries is a Judaic principle. And so with this one, with the pagan impulse, anti-Semitism is it's the next logical step.
Right.
It's like, no, we should rule. God loves us, not the Jews. You guys are wrong.
Well, why? But the justification is almost always, why does God choose you instead? Well, because we deserve it, right? And this is one of the key elements of Judaism. People on the alt-right often conflate Judaism with the same ethno-state that they desire, the same pagan ethno-state that they desire. But no, Judaic ethics is a complete inversion of that, right? Moses is not an overman by any stretch of the imagination. He is a stutterer who needs help from his brother in order to
and nor was Israel ever an imperialist nation. It's like, I've given you this plot of land, you got that river to that river, hang out in here, and if you and if a stranger happens to walk in, treat them nice. You have a boundary with these people. These people, they are worshiping idols and they're sacrificing their kids. Don't hang out with them. But these guys over here, they're living peacefully. You dwelled in their land, like the Edomites at the end of Deuteronomy. They're your brethren because they're descendants of Esau. Treat them well. It's like they have a national boundary, and that's good. That's something that's of God. And so that the national boundary element is very much within the Judaic concept. But
I wanted to also connect that though to the idea of weakness, right? God chose the Jewish people in their weakness, right? It's not God chose me because we are the over.
He would have chosen Egypt.
Right. They were stronger in that sense, but God protected those who were slaves.
Yeah, it wasn't that, wow, I was so impressed with Pharaoh. I was so impressed with these big pyramids that I just decided to choose them. It's like, no, I heard their voice crying out to me in their weakness and in their oppression. And so I delivered them. Like that is the Judaic impulse. Which is why
the Jewish religion, though it has that tribal element because that tribe was the one chosen out by God to be the light to the other nations, is not the same thing as the pagan.
It's not the same
tribalism. So anyway,
we went into some weeds there, but it's good weeds.
To connect this to what I was saying previously, the values of the Jewish tribe, the values that Judaism espouses, being complete opposite of the pagan overman, being a support of the weak. I think that can show you the difference, which is hard for observers sometimes to grasp, right? You see a guy over here saying, I support Jesus. I think Jesus is the greatest thing, and I can't believe the stinking Jews would kill him, right? You see the guy who says that. And then you see a Christian over here who's supportive, an American Christian who's supportive of Israel. And Ben's kind of like, what?
Why? I like this guy, but I'm not sure why they came to different conclusions.
What's the difference there?
Are you guys familiar with the hymn written by Stuart Townend called How Deep the Father's Love for Us?
Yeah.
There's a line in it, and I think it's in the last verse. Behold the man upon a cross, my sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers.
Right.
The way you described in your article, the way a unconverted pagan, even an unconverted pagan who appreciates the Christian element of his upbringing and all the things you hear on the alt-right, or cultural Christianity, even though we don't believe the truths of it, that person looks at the gospel narrative, like you say in your article, and they say, those guys are killing Jesus. They're killing the hero. I would never do such a thing because I'm of better stock.
Mm-hmm.
The Christian impulse is like the hymn says, ashamed I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. He's crucified for my sins. Exactly. I'm the one that's nailing him to the cross. Like Jesus was the like the way Nietzsche phrases it, there's no more Jewish concept than a God dying on a cross, dying a slave insurrectionist's death. Because just, if you wouldn't mind, kind of just like elaborate on that a little bit, like that's the fundamental difference is one's the pagan, one's the Christian, and it's really just, do you believe it or not?
Yeah, I think we can even generalize this even a little bit more, because I think you see this even in things like the Tea Party otherizing cultural Marxism as kind of like an enemy, or you see it in Alex Jones's conspiracy theorizing about a cabal of globalists that run everything. And you
don't forget the pedophiles. Don't forget the pedophiles.
Yeah, he's got some interesting theories on all that. But you also see it, especially amongst the anti-Semites, is that particular problem of seeing problems within your society, and I've seen this in a number of people who just walk down this path almost seemingly inexplicably.
Yeah, nice, good conservative. All of a sudden, you're like, "What in the world happened?"
Yeah, and they'll see, like the one I'm thinking of actually sees a problem that an evangelical Christian 20 or 30 years ago was raving about. Pornography, just the rampant pornography destroying our society, right? Evangelical Christians were all over that, saying this is terrible. We're just engaging in a social experiment that who knows what kind of negative ramifications it's going to have. The crazy conspiracy theorist today repeats some of that, says, I can't believe that what this pornography is doing, how it's trapping young white men and keeping them enslaved to some cabal of Jews for some reason, right? It's like, you're like, where did that come from?
Well, always blame the other.
Yeah, it's I think, and the reason I said that you see this in the Reagan critique of cultural Marxism sometimes is just an impulse to see the problems that exist within your own society as somehow a foreign influence entirely. And I do not think that that's the case. I do not think some group of Frankfurt School theorists convinced all of America to suddenly become, by tricking them, right? No, there's something within America itself, within the people of America, that are prone to certain left-wing ideas and that are also prone to certain right-wing ideas. And we're also resistant to them, I think, in some very, very good ways. But the problems that you see on leftist college campuses and the problems that you see on the alt-right are problems of us. This is our problems. These are our sins manifesting themselves. And so that the attempt to go ahead.
Can you explain your last point to me too? Because maybe this is just me it probably just is, to your last point about equating in evangelicals who were concerned about porn, what it does to a society. Okay. It felt like I just heard an equation of them with conspiracy theorists today.
Oh, no. Okay, so yeah, the evangelicals who are worried about what's going on with pornography are saying this is a very bad thing. The alt-right are also saying it's a bad thing. But the alt-right is creating a conspiracy of this isn't a result of our sin as America. The evangelical is like a prophet standing up and saying, America, you are wrong.
Okay.
The alt-right guy is standing up and saying, no, this group of Jews over here is tricking you. It's like, no, that's wrong. That's wrong. You need to be able to see in yourself the sin. And I think in some weird sense, Joe Rogan, a complete atheist, as far as I know, has Alex Jones on his show doing these wacky conspiracy theories and talking about God and demons and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
Joe Rogan's perspective is far more Christian. I mean, when Alex Jones talks about how, well, didn't you know that this particular group scientifically experimented on these people and whatever, he kind of goes, yeah, I can see how a scientist would, get all heady and think that they figured things out and fall into that.
He's seeing the potential vice within his own heart.
Exactly right. That's a far more Christian perspective, I think, than the guy who says, no, this must be a cabal of globalists. I would never do such a thing. So
exactly. And that it reminds me of, I think it's an apocryphal quote, but it's one that's often attributed to G.K. Chesterton. They say, "Sir, what's wrong with the world?" And he responded, "Dear sir, I am." Yours, G.K. Chesterton. That it's what.
That's good.
It's these guys. It's these guys. It's them. It's them. It's always a problem externally that can be solved, can be understood, can be handled. But the Christian impulse is to internalize it to a degree. I mean, obviously, there's an unhealthy direction you can take that also.
Well, that's the reason the alt-right rises, is they see the pathological way that the leftist messianists take this self-laceration. I mean, what we do to ourselves in our culture, I think, is every bit as wacky and weird as any Catholic monk whipping himself in order to get closer to Christ ever was. The way we, you know what I'm saying? The kind of self-criticism that the crazy leftists do on college campus, saying.
So when the Black Panther movie comes out, the lady posts, "How many days should I wait in order to give you a safe space to watch your movie?" I think Shapiro tweeted out, "Well, you could just kill yourself, and then your presence would never have to bother anyone ever again." Like, why do you think that's sitting there attending a movie is offending somebody?
Yeah.
So you think you're exactly right. The pathology of that leads to the right-wing reactionary pagans. It gives them a point, which is not a good thing.
So, and Norm, I have one more question too, just broadly, and maybe it's difficult to even answer this, but what is one thing from your review that you want people like Shapiro and others who think like him to take away from your review about Protestantism? Like, if you could narrow it down to something, what would it be?
Well, I think, honestly, the point we just made is the big one that I would love Ben to internalize, because I think that really worries him. I think that worries him. And I think American Christianity, and I think he kind of knows this too, just instinctually. He sees something different about, and by experience, that American Christianity is somehow different. And I think the reason that it's so different is that we do not have the same level of temptation that some Christians in Europe have. The far right in Europe is all alt-right. They all.
It's only an alternative in the United States.
Yeah, it only becomes an alternative to the right in the United States, exactly, where our conservatism is a principled classical liberalism from a bygone era. But in America, because we have no ethnos, right? We have no particular people group that defines us ethnically. We don't as easily fall into the type of paganism that French people do or German people do. That doesn't mean we can't, because the alt-right resurrects an old class distinction between free people and unfree people, and the phenotypic indicator of that, white versus black, and then turns that into a pagan ethnos. And that's, of course, awful. But in America,
no ancient Norwegian thought, "Oh, I'm a white man."
Yeah, exactly. It's actually ideological every bit as much as conservatism is ideological, or any ism is ideological. It's an ideology of whiteness, which has never existed in human history. There is no white race. There is no white experience. The closest thing, I guess you could even say, would have been Europe as a whole. But Europe, again, was united by Christianity or Catholicism. They were never, "I'm white."
Germans would have noticed.
They would have noticed that these people over there who were invading from, the Mongols or whoever else were a different color, but they were not identifying or especially attributing their successes or their achievements to whiteness. That is a completely ideological modern idea that just springs from a pagan impulse attached to an outdated class system, which is just absurd.
But to Anthony's point, I think saying, so what would be the takeaway that you'd want Shapiro to take? Like, okay, Luther had some problems, just like Donald Trump has some problems, frankly.
Yeah.
But the Protestant experiment is on your side, Ben.
Yeah, it's exactly
and
right.
The goal is to keep the Protestant Christians believing, because once it just becomes a shell of religion, it can fall into
Yes, exactly.
the tribal ethno paganism real quick.
Right. That's a really good point there that I want to emphasize even more. There's a reason, Ben, why the most believing evangelicals, though you'll find them the most annoying because they're going to be the ones that try to convert you, they're going to be the ones that are most supportive of Israel. They're going to be the ones that are most resistant to the alt-right. And I think he probably knows that. And and I hope the article is enlightening in that way, to give an ideological or a philosophical reason for understanding why that is.
Put up with our trying to convert you and talking about gay issues that makes you uncomfortable.
Right.
Because when it comes down to it, it was Bonhoeffer who stood up to the Nazis. All of the secularists went right along with him.
Right, exactly. And the liberal Protestants as well.
The liberal Protestantism went right along with him.
Yeah. And I actually, in the very end of the piece, do conflate, intentionally leave it vague as to who I'm talking about when whether I'm talking about Donald Trump, who's the guy who's, boisterous and has embarrassing and has moral failings, or whether it's Martin Luther. And I intentionally did that. Hopefully he I'm sure he got the point.
It's kind of like you're embarrassed to vote. Shapiro's going to vote for Trump in 2020. I think he's made that fairly clear without actually saying it, but he's embarrassed to. You know, and it's kind of like the way evangelicals are with Luther. It's like, was he touching in pagan impulse? Probably. Did it lead to his personal anti-Semitism? Almost certainly. But that being said, he was right in a lot of respects. And just like it's kind of embarrassing to throw our weight behind somebody as morally compromised as Donald Trump when it comes to the nationalism question, when it comes to the defense of the unborn question, when it comes to 1,000 other issues.
When it comes to Americanism and actually deeply understanding a non-racial vision of America.
The flag-waving Americanism.
He's right on that.
He goes up there and he hugs the American flag. It's embarrassing, but something inside you goes, yep. Here I stand, I can do no other.
Exactly right.
So that wraps us up for this week, and thank you again to Kent for joining us. Follow us on Twitter at Politics Outside, on Facebook at Think Outside Politics, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at Think Outside Politics. You can follow Norman on Twitter at Norman G. Young, Kent at Kent_E_Young, and myself at Tony D. Leonardi. We'll see you next week.
Think outside politics, yeah.